I'll say, for myself, it's an honor to be here, an honor to be a Michigan notable book author in the 20th year of the Notable Books. The Michigan Notable Books is my favorite award, and I love the understatement of it. I love what Randy said. It's not the best books, it's 20 notable books. We're so humble in this state. We're so democratic. You know? And what I love about this award, they don't even choose a winner. It's like, there's a whole group of books. They're all notable. It's fun. But I guess we can say that about the Pulitzer this year. It's very democratic. Don't choose a winner. Yeah, it's not the wondrous books. It's not the Michigan magnificent books. It's not the notable books. And it is an overwhelming pleasure to be sitting with 2 National Book Award winners. And it's especially a pleasure for me to be asking the questions rather than answering the questions.
We're going to ask her some questions.
So before I start asking the questions of these 2 very notable writers, I'm going to warn you that I don't just think of the books of living writers as fabulous artifacts. I don't think of them as just objects. I think of these as the concrete result of a whole bunch of decisions made by their authors, either consciously or unconsciously. And it seems that these 2 authors have made a lot of really good decisions in writing these books. I want to offer to, I'm going to ask questions, but I'm going to offer to Jaimy and Jesmyn the right that if you don't like my question, just answer another question that you have in your head. That'll be fine. And to start with, I would like to invite both writers to say a little something about their work. And in case these authors want a little guidance about what they might talk about, I would say that both of your novels contain some autobiographical material. And often before writers sit down to create fiction that relates to a personal experience, there's a period of contemplation. Sometimes there's a long period of contemplation, years or decades. And I'd love to hear what inspired both of you to go forth with this particular material, the hurricane, the racetrack, and transform it into a novel. And whatever you can tell us about that transformation would be very interesting to all of us. And I would ask Jaimy to go first.
Okay, why did it take me 40 years to finally write a racetrack novel? It's a notorious fact. I worked on the track between 1967 and 1970. And in fact, when this book came out, I was most afraid that that racetrack people would find it a complete fraud, because I knew the racetrack very well from 1967 to 1970, but that was it. I never went back and worked on the racetrack again, and really had few opportunities even to go and do something I love to do, bet on horses, between those times. I'm just slow. That's the only real... I got around to working on the story that was going to be my sketch for the racetrack novel in 1995. And I had uncommon good luck with that story, which appeared in the Michigan Quarterly Review. It came out in Best American Short Stories. Why? Because Jane Smiley was editing Best American Short Stories that year. And if it had a racetrack in it, she was definitely going to look at it very closely, right? Then I knew for sure I was going to write the novel, so now I was really in a hurry, and it took me 25 more years to finally write the novel. I actually had a draft of this novel by about 2001, but when I gave it to my then agent, no longer my agent, she did not agree that it was my most commercial novel, and handed it back to me after showing it to a few people. And even though even though I thought she was wrong enough to part company with her, my confidence in the book was somewhat shaken, and especially because there was this character in it that had shown up in practically everything I'd written. A young woman, reckless, kind of a drifter, kind of foolish but well endowed with language, who I just was sick of. I had enough of that woman, and especially since other people had clearly not shown the same interest in her that I had. And she seemed to me to have stolen into this book that I meant to be a social novel about the racetrack, and I thought she had ruined it. So I had a hard time going back to work on it. I mean, it's a long story why I finally did go back to work on it, but thank God I did. It really involved my having to come to terms with her as well as the other characters. But by the time I finished the book, I was identifying, I'm by far the oldest person at this table, as you can probably tell by the book. And in Lord of Misrule, there are two characters, a loan shark from Baltimore, about 68, and a groom named Medicine Ed from South Carolina, 72 and 73 in the novel. Both of them are looking at a friendless old age in which their fondest hopes have not been realized. And I so identified with those two characters by the time I went back to work on the book, that that's what got me through. If there are two autobiographical characters in this book, by the time I finished Lord of Misrule, it was those two, not Maggie. That's the story on that.
It didn't take you quite as long, did it, your material?
No, it didn't. It took me around, it took me 2.5 years after Katrina to begin working on Salvage the Bones. And even sort of after Katrina occurred, at the time, like during the immediate aftermath of the storm, I didn't really think that I'd ever write anything about it until Laura Koschitzky said, "This is your story." She told me that because that's when I was at Michigan. I completed the program, but I'd come back to teach for a year. And so she said, "This is your story. You have to tell this story." And then I took that feedback, and at that time I couldn't conceive of writing about the hurricane in a piece of fiction. So I actually just wrote an essay so I wouldn't forget anything about my experience, my family's experience during Hurricane Katrina. And then I just let that essay sit on my computer for 2.5 years. And I think part of the reason why that happened, and I didn't realize this until the book came out and then I began talking about the book with people, is that the storm affected me in ways that I wasn't aware of. It was traumatizing, and I don't think that I was like fully aware of that, even though I was fully there for the experience of it, And so it did. That storm sort of silenced me for a while because after the year after the storm occurred, like a year later, that's when I moved back home. I left Michigan and moved back home, and I was working as an instructor at the University of New Orleans, which is in New Orleans East, which was one of the hardest hit parts of that city as far as Hurricane Katrina goes. And so that was a tough drive to make every day. And so I think it was a combination of that, of just the insanity, that you endure when you don't evacuate and you stay for a Category 5 hurricane, and then also driving through the aftermath of that storm in New Orleans a couple of times every week, that I think really silenced me for a while, so that I didn't write anything until at the end of that 2.5 years, I suddenly felt that need to write again. I wanted to put something down on paper, and even then I didn't know that I was going to write about the hurricane. I had the main 3 characters in my head. I had Esh in my head, and Skeeta, and China. because I knew for a while, basically for the whole 2.5 years, that I wanted to write about a girl that grows up in a world full of men. And then I also knew Skeeta, you know, the strange boy that's in love with his pit bull. I also knew him and had known about him for maybe like 5 years because I discovered him in a writing exercise that I did at the University of Michigan. And so I knew those characters, but when I sat down to really write the book, I didn't know where they were going. Like I didn't know where they would end up in the end of the book. And so, but I wanted to begin. And then it just, you know, sometimes inspiration does strike, and it hit me in that moment that's the end that I was writing towards. That they would face this hurricane. They would face Hurricane Katrina. I had no idea what would happen in the middle. But that's what I wrote towards. But it was, you know, when I got to the part where the hurricane actually made landfall, that was difficult for me because I had to remember that my experience of the hurricane wasn't my character's experience of the hurricane. And so that chapter actually required a lot of work. I had to go back to that chapter again and again to try to get it right from their perspective and not from my perspective.
Yeah, because that was a particular geographical, that place where they were had its own unique geographical characteristics that made it particularly rough. Oh, that's really interesting, actually, of both of you, seriously. That drive, that's really fascinating, thinking about that drive through the wreckage. Because we're at the Michigan Notable Books Award, we cannot avoid a question about Michigan. And neither of you is from Michigan, but Michigan has had some effect on you. And Jesmyn, you've reported in interviews the importance of your time at U of M, working with Peter Ho Davies and others. I think Nicholas Delbanco and Laura Kashiski, I think you had in a class. And you have been quoted as saying, I loved Michigan, although it was very alien to me. And Jaimy, you may not have chosen this place from among all other places for its qualities, but you've been here since 1981, and a long time, and dare I say longer than you've been anywhere else, perhaps, okay. And Jaimy is originally from the east part of our country. Those Michiganders and Michiganians in the audience, I'm being inclusive here, would love to hear what influence our Great Lakes state has had on your writing. Jessica?
I suspected she was going to ask me this, so here I am a little bit prepared. So I went to college in Ohio, Antioch, the Lethia school, where I had a daring boyfriend, not my present husband, who, when he was in college, learned how to fly airplanes, more or less. Right? It almost killed me over Pittsburgh, but that's a different story. One day, when he was feeling particularly reckless, he flew north to a strange place I'd never even thought about before, Michigan. He came back and he said, they are really strange up there in Michigan. They're mildly friendly. They're not crybabies. They'll help you if you really need it. More than anything, they're not impressed. He was from the Virgin Islands, and he added in a kind of wonderment, they really like it up there with the lakes. I had about 20 years to mull that over before I became, accidentally, reluctantly, a Michigan writer, or rather a writer living in Michigan. And I was here a good 25 years before I became more truly a Michigan writer. What happened was, on my running route at that time, there was a flasher. I didn't know he was a flasher until I'd seen him about 20 times, but I knew there was. But I had so much time to mull it over. Like, why do I think he is so strange? He dresses just like my students. What's wrong with him? Anyway, eventually he flashed to me, and then eventually he went to jail, and that actually is kind of a tragic story. He turned out, wouldn't you know it, although I didn't know this until I was well into the essay, to be related to one of the great Kalamazoo fortunes, the paper industry fortune. And in fact, he knew about my running route because his family had owned it, and he'd grown up near there. Anyway, I was going to take my revenge on Michigan. For years I've been saying, I've been sent to Siberia to all my friends in the East. And you know, like Dostoevsky, as Dostoevsky said of Siberia, where he had been sent, it's not that bad, it's really not. You know, it's a bracing climate. People are okay. That was kind of my tone about Michigan until I wrote this essay, which was going to be my revenge essay about Michigan and self-hatred. I looked on exposing oneself, on being a flasher, as the sexuality of self-hatred. After all, a flasher shows his genitals so women will go scream and run away. So it's the perfect sexuality of self-hatred. I won't even read it. I brought the beginning of that essay, but I won't have to read it. The weird thing was that having written that essay, as so often happens, once you write about a thing, you belong to it in some way. And then after that, I felt this deep affection for Kalamazoo and Michigan. I felt that I understood it better, that I had fully arrived there. Well, there is I am going to read just the very beginning of that essay, if I can find it quickly, because you'll see why there was a point of identification. I feel at home in a town that hates itself. After I left it, Baltimore, which is where I was raised, Baltimore came up in the world and its own eyes. But for me, it was too late. I gravitated to another city rich in self-disgust, Kalamazoo, whose burghers sneer at its mistakes and whose youth can't wait to get out, or say they can't. If they're still there in their 30s, they usually are, they slouch around in jeans and flannel shirts, just like my flasher, smoking cigarettes and grinning sheepishly. They blame no one else for their troubles. I like them, these good-natured volunteers for their own defeat. And on from there. Anyway, I felt that I was much more a part of them than I ever realized. And ever since then, I felt truly like a Michigan writer. And all those characteristics of Michigan that vanished boyfriend so perfectly described after a 15-minute acquaintance at an airport in Michigan in 1963, perhaps. Okay, that's my... Anyway, I'm very proud now to be a Michigan writer and among such terrific writers as are here getting their awards today. I mean, this is a really great group of books, and I was very proud to be part of the, even though I was not part of the group that got mentioned. I missed it last year, and I'm really happy to be here this year.
You know, I'm glad to hear you say that. I was meant to write a response to that first paragraph of that essay that Jaimy read about all the self-hating Michiganders. But so you got your own, you wrote your own response though, so that's
anyway,
good.
I don't think it's true. I'm kind of to revise my opinions.
Well, you know, it's interesting that that your boyfriend said that, you know, Michigan people were not impressed because, you know, I contacted University of Michigan behind Jesmyn's back. I was trying to find out, you know, about some, you know, drunken debauchery she had taken part in, you know, some terrible mistake she had made or some, but all I could find were people saying how wonderful Jesmyn Ward was. And so I was a little in awe of meeting her today, and I'll just say that before she speaks, I'll say that her advisor, Peter Hodavies, was in awe of her ferocious work ethic. So,
that's what I did during my time here at Michigan. I worked a lot, but it wasn't driven by some sort of like, you know, I'm not this, you know, moral, sort of structured person. I did it because I was desperate. Because I thought if I don't write a novel now in my 2 years here at Michigan, I will never write a novel. And so I just sort of like fumbled and sprinted my way through it. So that's why there's no embarrassing stories, because I was like locked in my room trying to, write a decent novel. I did love my time here at Michigan. It was really hard for me to leave. I think I applied to lots of different MFA programs, and I was lucky enough to get into Michigan. And I didn't know much about the school before I came here. The school was actually recommended to me by a poet named Amy Quanberry, and she also received her MFA at the University of Michigan, and then she went on to become a Stegner Fellow at Stanford. And so that's where I encountered her as an undergraduate. I was an undergraduate, and she was a Stegner Fellow. And I worked with her while I was there. And then when I was applying to the program, she said, you should apply for Michigan. It's a great school. And so I had no idea what I was doing. And so I applied to Michigan. And I applied to this like cluster of schools in the South because I thought I wanted to go back home and be closer to the South. Because I was in New York at the time, I was applying to schools. And then, she told me to apply to Michigan, and I was like, okay, I'll apply to Michigan. So it was this one school, was an outlier in Michigan that I applied to, the farthest north. And I got in, and I visited, and I met my roommate in the elevator of the hotel, and she said, are you coming here? And I said, yes, I'm coming here. And then I asked her if she was coming here, and she said yes. And then she was like, I was like, well, do you want to be roommates? And so I met my roommate in the elevator, and she is still one of my best friends. And that was what my experience was like. Like this, the program specifically, but also, just my experience in the state in general, like everyone was so welcoming and so warm, and I became part of such a great community of writers and people in general, during my time here, that I was able to flourish, and I think that if I'd gone anywhere else, I think I would have wilted. And so, that's why I always say that I love my time here at Michigan, because I did have that support, which was really important, to me actually, following through and really committing to attempting to be a writer. So yeah, I still love Michigan. It was hard for me to leave because I found that sense of community and found a sense of belonging that I think that I had been missing and hadn't had in my life for a long time, especially considering that I was coming from New York City. I've been in New York City after undergrad. New York City I was eaten alive, so Michigan was a very, very wonderful experience.
Glad to hear that. A phrase that we writers hear a lot nowadays is writing about place, and some of us are called writers of place. I'm known as a Michigan writer. Jesmyn is known as a writer of Mississippi. And I don't know if this is just a new way of saying that we're regional writers. I don't know if it's a new nicer way somehow of saying that. And too much attention to the phrase does bother me a little, does worry me. I've actually had students confess to me in despair, I don't have a place. And I keep telling them, that's okay. Your place could be a living room, that's okay. But Jesmyn, you do write about Mississippi, and I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'll quote you here. In your interviews, you have some beautiful quotes. In the LA Times interview, you've had such beautiful things. It's that responsibility I feel to tell the stories about the people and the place I'm from. And Jaimy has written about, most recently, a West Virginia racetrack and a Baltimore nut house. Can I use that phrase? Is that okay? Okay, I think it was called the Bug House there in the book. And I wonder, Jaimy, does that make you a writer of institutions in some way? I wonder from both of you, in what ways is place or are places important in your writing, and in any way that you want to think about that question? I'll ask Jesmyn first.
But place is really important to me. I I feel like I encounter writers, I often encounter writers who are not bound by place and who are able to just write about, and write beautifully about whatever strikes their fancy, you know, whether it is, you know, a small town in the South, or it's, you know, a small town in Korea, or, you know, just anywhere. And I always admire writers that can do that, because so far I haven't been able to do that. And partly I think the reason that I haven't been able to do that is because I do feel such a responsibility to the people in my community, and then also just to the place itself and the history that informs that place. And that's why I think I'm sort of stuck in writing about Mississippi again and again. And who knows, that might change in the future, but for right now, I don't know, I feel like, you know, I write the kind of books that I want to read, and I write about people that I feel like have been absent, you know, in the public conversation. And for me, that's like poor, rural, southern people. And so, and that's important to me, you know. It's one of the reasons that I feel like I write. So for right now, yeah, I'm stuck in Mississippi. Who knows, maybe in the future I can, you know, fall into my imagination and, you know, surrender to it and write about some other place. But right now, I really do feel it's like a yoke. It's like a yoke of responsibility that I feel to write about Mississippi.
I only actually lived in Baltimore until I was 16, but it turns up in everything that I write, including this racetrack novel. It's more like a curse than a sense of responsibility in some way. I mean, I am the classic outsider figure, and I'm always writing about outsider figures. And a racetrack is nothing but outsiders. Even if people stay on the racetrack for 20, 25 years, they're doing their best to keep most of their operations secret from everybody else on that racetrack. That's especially if it's a cheap racetrack. And that's what I suppose most fascinated me. West Virginia is not very far from Baltimore. And when I first came back to Baltimore after getting out of college, first I lived in California for a couple of years, but then I wanted to live in the country, as close to Baltimore as I could be. So I lived around Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, and I worked for a prison, I worked for the newspapers, and I fell in with racetrackers. And that I was still working for the newspapers when I got completely hypnotized by this handsome, persuasive, crazy racetrack guy who I worked for the next 3 years. But I always knew I would write about it one way or another. It just was going to take a long time. But one of the main reasons that I wanted to write about it was, in a remote sort of way, again, that sense of responsibility. It was a vanishing way of life. And there were the people that I learned everything that I knew as a groom from were mostly these old-timey black grooms from the South who had been on the racetrack their entire lives, never had a chance to get a formal education of any kind, and they were stuck there. You know, I was deeply moved by that. They were coming into their old age. There was no provision made. Later in the 80s, the Horsemen's Benevolent Protective Association started to concoct some sort of insurance scheme for such people. But that was not the case when I was on the track. And these guys had to work until they dropped. You know, I knew that compared to them, I was just a tourist on the racetrack in some way. But they were kind and receptive to me, and they knew everything about horses. And they were good to horses compared to most of the people who were exploiting the horses for their own interests. Anyway, it was more because I really felt that somebody needed to write about them than any other single thing that I kept coming back to that book. The The loan shark, well, that was my Uncle Willie, although I didn't know that when I first started to work with that material. It just hit me like a bomb. Oh my God, that's my Uncle Willie. He was murdered in 1980, and you know, it's an interesting thing about Jewish immigrants. And in fact, I thought when I talked to the Hadassah Book Club in Kalamazoo about this book, I thought, well, they will cringe with horror when I talk about this loan shark, this Jewish gangster. But you know, I can own him because my mother's Baltimore family was full of horse players and petty mobsters. But one after another, after that evening was over, the women came up to me and said, you know, I can tell you about my Uncle Louis. I mean, their children went to college, but that first generation was not so pure, actually. It was very interesting. So, but as I say, oh, there's one more thing I want to say. You know, I became an honorary. West Virginia has nothing but its identity as West Virginia. I mean, in terms of wealth. So, to qualify to be a West Virginia writer, you have to win the National Book Award. Then they reluctantly make you an honorary West Virginia writer. But the truth is, I learned how to write about West Virginians because of Michigan. Because there's enough in common between these two states so wrecked by by corporate money, one way or another. And people kind of living in the aftermath of that. I mean, West Virginia has a very serious problem, a very special kind of racism that you can only have if you don't have any black people living there. And Michigan could not possibly, that's that same exact thing. But other than that, there were enough things in common between the two very democratic states. So I used many life lessons from Michigan and writing about West Virginia folk.